Hello, and welcome to another edition of Focus One. Today we are very lucky to have former Congressman Dan Miller as our guest. Congressman Miller served as our representative for the 13th Congressional District of Florida from 1993 through 2002. Has Congress become less civil and more polarized in the decade since he served our area? If so, why? What does the congressman think about the GOP primary race? How will the winner fare against the president in November? And what are the prospects for more effective governance in 2013 and beyond? Congressman Miller, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here, Frank. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I just want to start off with just a little bit of recollection. I went back and just took a look at congressional approval ratings from 1975 to the present. From 75 to 1995, they hovered between 20 and 40%. I think they might have went over maybe like 41% for a little while there in the 1980s. You come in 1993, and when you come in, the approval ratings were near 40%. But between 1998 and 2005, they go up between 40 to 60%. And in fact, around the 9/11 disaster, they actually, a spirit of unity shot up to 80%. And then they begin to come down a little bit. Under the Obama administration, actually, the approval ratings ticked back up to about 40% in 2009, and then as we approach the 2010 elections, the numbers just tank, and actually they go below 20% for the first time in quite some time, and right now we're in an area of like around 10% congressional approval, all-time low. It doesn't perfectly correlate to your tenure there, but what's different between the Dan Miller era and what's going on now?
Well, there's been a series of trends happening. One of the key ones, I think, is that more and more members get elected in primaries rather than general elections. And then when you put on top of that, the past three elections have been wave elections. In 2006 and 2008, there were Democratic wave elections where it was just almost any Democrat could get elected. By the time we got to 2010, it was a Republican wave election. When you get these wave elections, large numbers of people get elected from one party, and the people in the middle get defeated.
Purging of the moderates.
And it's going to happen even more this time around. We just saw about Olympia Snowe not running for re-election. And you see some of these redistricting states, like in North Carolina, several of the Blue Dog Democrats are not running again because they're being redistricted out. So it's going to get even worse next year. So when people get elected in primaries, and maybe 350 people of the 435 in the House are really elected in their primaries, they don't need a lot of votes. And the people that vote in primaries are the most conservative or the most liberal. Mm-hmm. And so when you get district, it's not all gerrymandering.
Right.
I mean, states are the same way. I mean, there's no way a Democrat's going to get elected to the Senate from Utah, and there's no way a Republican's going to get elected. I would say Massachusetts, but it happened. Right. But the person most targeted, for example, this time around by the Democrats in the Senate is the most moderate Republican there is, Brown in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was unique that he got elected. So the problem is the moderates are being purged. And so you're elected by primaries, and those are the most conservative, most liberal. And so it's just been happening more and more over the past, actually, several decades.
And in addition to who we end up electing in these various, in each election cycle, during the period of governance that happens after the election, if one believes that we're not in 24/7, 365 election cycles, the political science community and the literature notices that there's a trend in terms of increasing party fidelity or party loyalty. So you're getting fewer and fewer folks in Congress to reach across the lines and vote in a bipartisan way. And do you think that's, again, consistent with, is that a function of there are more liberal and conservatives that are being elected as opposed to moderates, or is there anything to do with the idea that even if you happen to be moderate, you cannot risk crossing party lines?
Elections
risk the fury of the
Well, for the primaries, we're seeing that, for example, in the Indiana Senate race with Lugar, and out in Utah with Orrin Hatch are being pushed to the right, and they have moved their voting records much more conservative the past couple years. 2 years ago, in 2010, Republicans lost 3 Senate seats they should have won because the nominee that was selected was so far right-wing it was not electable.
Right.
In Delaware, in Nevada and Colorado. And Alaska, they did almost the same thing, except for she got a write-in.
Right.
But I mean, when primaries, the people that vote in these are the most conservative and the most liberal. But we can see that in the presidential nomination fight that's going on right now. I mean, that's who shows up at these, at caucuses or at primaries.
Talk to me a little bit about your views on the filibuster. That's certainly something that I think it's a tool that has been used increasingly over the past couple of decades. And you don't actually have to filibuster anymore. I know this is the Senate chamber, but you just have to say that you're about to filibuster, and that has, I think, in my opinion, taken a tool that would be used in extreme type of legislation in order to protect the minority to almost a routine supermajority requirement or threshold for anything to get done in Congress. Well, you think filibuster is being overused? Would you like to see the rules change in terms of how it's
I think it's probably overused. However, when our founders drafted the Constitution, they wanted a slow, deliberate process. We're not a parliamentary system where the parliament is, one party takes over and boom, and they have, pretty much they can move very quickly. We can't move very fast in this country, and there's something good for saying that happening. That when Republicans took charge, they couldn't move, things very quickly. When one party totally controls the system and can avoid the filibuster, like the Democrats did after the 2008 election, or like the Republicans have in Tallahassee, it's one-party rule. There's no checks and balances. I like a system of government that has checks and balances, and I think the Democrats abused it in 2009 and 10, and that's one reason they lost the elections. I see Republicans abusing it in Tallahassee.
Coming back to that point about, yes, we certainly, the system of checks and balances, we need to have it there. However, if you need 60 out of 100 senators to vote for a piece of legislation, if we just forget about the D's and the R's for a second, I think that Americans as well as our legislators, you've got liberals, conservatives, moderates. They're not 60% of the country is not going to be liberal nor conservative, and so you do need a coalition that includes moderates to get something done. And if there are no more moderates left in Congress, what's that going to do? Can that protection become a point of actual paralysis in terms of governance?
That's going to be interesting because we have a major legislation that has to be passed at the end of this year. We have all these tax cuts from the Bush years, from the payroll tax, and because of the super committee failure last year, there's supposed to be over $1 trillion in automatic spending cuts. I mean, Bernanke testified in Congress here this week about this giant, massive fiscal cliff we're getting ready to go over. So Congress is going to have to act, and so it's going to be interesting how they act. The most productive time in Congress, in my experience has been, is the year after a presidential election. If you just think, actually go back to 2009, is when Obama got elected, and of course they had the 60 votes in the Senate. But that's true after Bush was elected. Of course, 9/11 changed his administration. But we'll see next year. This is going to be the year where change is going to take place. Right now it's a total toss-up presidential election, and control of Congress is still up in the air. It's still early to project that. But this is when people have an opportunity to work together. But it's not going to be a wave election. Waves don't happen normally in presidential years. It did in 2008, but not normally.
So you think the prospects for more constructive collaboration within Congress and between Congress and the president, a little bit of sunlight perhaps once we get past this election, regardless of who wins?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I just want to come back to the issue of civility in politics. I participated late last year and last fall on a Tiger Bay panel, and you were there, and I appreciated your thoughts. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about whether you think things are becoming less civil. The public feels that way, but incivility has been around for quite some time. Right. Has it not?
Oh, yeah. You go back to the days of dueling. I mean, people were being physically beaten up in Congress at times back in the 19th century. So we're far removed from that. But what a lot of people say what changed Congress is when C-SPAN started covering Congress. And then Newt Gingrich actually carried it to a real level with special orders late in the evenings and such. But nowadays, with all the specialized channels of television, people get specialized news with the internet. That there's a lot more. There's no longer the Huntley Brinkley and the Walter Cronkite.
That's right. It's almost a very balkanized media,
Right.
both the cable TV as well as the internet. So I do think there is something to that, to the idea that we've got a lot of echo chambers, and then even though the electorate might not be much different than they used to be in terms of their feelings on issues, but it's sort of the extremes that make all the noise and sort of attract a lot of folks into these echo chambers.
Let me tell a little story. Back during the impeachment of Bill Clinton back in '98, I was, wanted to stay away from any talk about that, interviews or anything. But Joe Scarborough, who has a TV show now, was a representative of the Panhandle of Florida, very Republican area, hardcore Republican in the Panhandle of Florida. And Rob Wexler represented a district down in the Palm Beach, Lauderdale area, a very Jewish district, hardcore Democrat. They would go on these shows and just yell at each other and scream at each other. And one was beating up Bill Clinton, the other one was defending Bill Clinton. And I remember talking to Wexler, the Democrat, after. He's a really likable guy. You get a microphone in him, it's a different story.
Right.
And then he says, the people back in my district really are upset with you, defending Bill Clinton on this issue. He says, it makes me more popular back home. And that just shows, that district is hardcore Democrat. And so what he was doing was what the hardcore Democrats wanted him to do. Joe Scarborough was doing the same thing with the hardcore Republicans. Theater. And they liked it. And of course, Joe went on to make it do well on television with it.
He did. Morning Joe. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the GOP primary to date. Getting back to your point about where are the moderates, I'll give you an assessment. I don't see too many in terms of this particular field. Huntsman, perhaps, but he didn't fare all that well. I think you might view Romney, the Massachusetts moderate, or some of his background as being moderate. It's kind of odd in how that term is almost an epithet now.
Right.
In this you're a moderate as something like there's something horrible about that. But beyond that, I think I would characterize the rest of the field as solidly conservative, even though they point to one another and try to undercut one another and say that you're not a true conservative. But what's your assessment of the field in the race to this point?
Well, as I said earlier, it's the very conservative people that dominate the nomination process, especially at caucuses. There's nothing in our Constitution for political parties, and so every state gets to decide how they do this. And so, like recently, Senatorium got some momentum out of Minnesota. 45,000 people showed up at caucuses. And the people have to show up at a specific time to be there. Well,
they're the most passionate people that are going to show up.
Right. And so it's hard to judge. Now, Michigan had 1 million people vote in their primary, or I think we had 1.8 million. That primaries can be a little different. So the people show up are those very conservative, and so they're having to appeal to that. Now, Romney started back in January with a lot of appeal to independents, but that has fallen way off. Now, whether he can regroup, and I think he will. But it's kind of, he's being called a Massachusetts moderate, which is bad in the primary.
But it's not so bad in the general election. So yeah, he's trudging into Super Tuesday, and my sense is that the probability of him emerging as the nominee is extremely high. But the question remains. Is this ship going to be leaking, taking on water and listing too far to the right in order to sort of straighten things out? What do you think is going to happen this coming Tuesday? You think it's going to be settled, split decision? Which states are you going to be focused mostly on?
I'll be interested on Tennessee and Ohio are probably the two more interesting states.
Why Tennessee?
It's a state that Santorum needs to win strong, and I'd be interested in how that's a strange state. It's not as conservative, say, as Oklahoma, which very likely will go for Santorum, and Gingrich is ahead in Georgia. But Tennessee's going to be interesting. Ohio, of course, everybody's going to be watching, and right now the polls are showing that Romney is gaining. So it's nice to have the momentum right before the election day. But Tennessee, he didn't qualify for a couple of the districts, I believe, in that state, so he's going to miss out on some delegates. And that's a state that Romney can't win. The question is,
does Gingrich perhaps?
Well, I'm not. Gingrich has got some problems in that state too. So it's going to be interesting to watch Tennessee.
What happens in Tennessee?
It's the southern state. I mean, Romney's not strong in the South,
right?
And so this is a state that's more of a border state to some extent, and has gone. I mean, if you look at some of the people coming from going to the Senate from Tennessee, Baker. Corker, who's there now, I mean, they're not the far right that you find in other southern states. And so I think Tennessee would be an interesting, besides Ohio.
And in Ohio, let's say Romney claws back and actually takes that one as well. Do you think there's going to be a lot of pressure within the Republican Party to call it a wrap at that point?
No, I don't think. I mean, I think they've put so much time into this. I mean, Rick Santorum, that he's in it for the long haul. I mean, Newt Gingrich may have to, you know, he can win Georgia, but if he only picks up 35, 40% of the vote, which is why I think he probably will be in that area, it's going to be hard for him to keep in the race because you need money. You got to raise money just to pay, you know, your car expenses, your cell phone expenses. There's a lot of cost of a campaign that, you know, hotel rooms, airplane travel, and so it's going to be hard for Gingrich, I think, to stay in after Super Tuesday. Now, then it becomes more of a two-person race. Ron Paul is going to stay in to the end.
Right, Ron Paul.
I mean, he's got his little block of votes, and
his intent too. Sometimes I get a sense from Ron Paul that he's a smart guy, and he probably understands that his chances of winning the nomination and/or the presidency are pretty slim. But I think he's more interested in again carrying the flag for a movement and using his campaign as a means of getting his message out. And so.
Right.
He'll probably be right there.
Right.
Through
right.
Maybe get a little bit of airtime or platform time at the convention. Do you think they'll give it to him? Or?
I'm assuming so. I mean, it backfired on Republicans back in the '92 election when they gave Pat Buchanan some airtime, and he just went way off far right wing there.
What do you think? Well, Ron Paul, I think going far right will be fine for the campaign. It's just that if he starts talking about foreign policy, that could be a little bit of a risk for.
That's right. He's an interesting person. I served with him in Congress. I served with Rick Santorum, and of course, Newt in Congress, and you know, it was all interesting people with different agendas.
Mm-hmm.
And
let me come back to Newt Gingrich. Just after the Florida primary, the day that we woke up and we saw that Mitt Romney performed extremely well, did everything that he had to do. I was looking to see whether or not Santorum would have the week that he did. I think, you know, that wasn't that hard to predict. I didn't predict that he was going to win all three of those states that he did on February 7. But one of the ironies that I see is since that Gingrich has sort of risen and fallen 2 or 3 times, certain negative perceptions or framings have stuck on him, and I don't think he's going to get rid of them. The irony is the worst thing that he can do, or if he really wants to make Mitt Romney's life miserable, he would get out of the race shortly after Super Tuesday. But he's pledged to go on all the way through to the convention, and I do, you know, he marches to his own drummers, so I'm not so sure he's getting out, or I think that's going to be one of the interesting things.
Whether he withdraws or just suspends his campaign, it's going to be a money issue. I mean, the super PAC, this wealthy man in Las Vegas is giving him money to the super PAC.
That's the most important state in the race. It continues to be Nevada for Gingrich anyway.
But you still need to have money to operate. You know, you've got plane travel, you've got some aides you've got to pay, you've got these expenses. And so if he has no chance of winning, people aren't going to send money in. And he's already has some debt. So now Santorum raised about $9 million a month of February, so that's, you know, he's all of a sudden getting money, and money can be raised off the internet. And now Romney isn't doing as well with internet money. I mean, Obama did great with it.
Santorum's and Romney a lot of establishment money.
And he's gone after the $2,500 contributors, and they add up to the millions faster than $100 checks. But
if you get enough $100 checks, though, they can add up pretty quickly as well. Okay. Let's assume for the moment that Mitt Romney does win the nomination. How do you like his chances in November? And then just as an additional question, how nasty is this thing going to get as we approach November, just in terms of the money and the willingness, I think, of both candidates probably to go heavily negative?
Well, first of all, I'm a Republican, so I think there's probably a 50.1% chance that Romney wins. That's a lot. It's a toss-up election. 8 months is a very long time, and so a lot of things can happen. You know, gas prices are spiking now. That's one of the things that brought down Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election. So there's a lot of things that can and will happen. We don't know what these things unexpected, what's going to happen in the Middle East, or gaffes that somebody will make or something. And so the real election gets started in the fall. The negativity is going to be big time, especially with all the money that's pouring in. It's not going to be much worse than the past. But from a Obama standpoint, the question is it a referendum election or a choice election? Now, Obama wants to make a choice election, like it was 4 years ago. It was a choice between a Democrat and a Republican. Normally, for a re-election, it's a referendum election. do we want to give this person another 4 years?
Yeah, I agree with that.
But Republicans, that's what the Republicans, Obama doesn't want that. I mean, because there's a lot of things that have not gone well in this country. The economy is not what, he said it was going to be, and unemployment and such. So from a referendum standpoint, he's not going to win. He's got to make it a choice. And to make it a choice, he's got to demonize his opponent. So, I mean, the negativity is going to be on both sides. But there's incentive from the Obama standpoint to demonize their opponent. Now, if Rick Santorum got the nomination, which I don't think will happen, it'd be easy to demonize.
Speaking of demonizing, Rick Santorum literally demonizes, I think, he sees a lot of demons in a lot of different places.
He's unelectable, in my opinion.
What do you think the chances are? We hear a lot of talk about a brokered election and hand-wringing, and again, I don't think that that's going to happen. But if Romney continues to stumble and it becomes an increasingly difficult slog for him, what are the chances of Jeb Bush riding into Tampa on a white horse in an attempt to rescue the Republican Party?
First of all, it's not going to be Jeb Bush. The country's Bushed out, so there's not going to be a Bush, involved this time around. I mean, Jeb might have been a better president than his brother, but that's, the country doesn't want another
Neither
Bush.
here nor there so you don't think that'll happen?
Not Bush, but there are other people that, in theory. But if it goes to the Tampa convention in August,
doesn't that become a spectacle?
It's a spectacle. And
it's a bigger liability than a weaker candidate, I think.
Right. There's not time to regroup. It's not time to raise money. I mean, the election would be over with if they're still fighting at the convention. So, but I think Romney is going to keep accumulating delegates, and the delegate is going to start increasing. Like on Super Tuesday, he's going to win Virginia, almost all those delegates. He'll win Massachusetts. He'll win Vermont. He's a good chance of winning Idaho. And then he'll still pick, and he has a reasonable chance to pick up Ohio. And so if they look at the total delegate count, he's going to win Tuesday, if that's the headline. It's always interesting how they treat headlines and stories. Sometimes they say, well, Michigan was a tie because they had each got the same number of delegates. Well, of course, now it's changed. But anyway, Romney won, but it's that headline. So I think when that headline starts showing, Romney's got the delegates and picking up all those states, then as they keep going along, now, Santorum and so is Paul are focusing on these caucus states because that's where the small turnout can happen. Now, Idaho, for example, is a caucus state, but there's a lot of Mormon population there, so they say there's a good chance that Romney would do okay in that caucus state. Romney does not do as well in caucuses. Caucuses were one of the keys to get Obama's nomination win.
No, yes, I think that in all honesty, if I had to pick one reason why Obama defeated Hillary Clinton is I don't think the Clinton team read the rule book as carefully as they should have in terms of the rule changes associated with proportional delegates. And so you had, on Super Tuesday, you had Hillary Clinton winning the big states in Pennsylvania, New York, and the Northeast, but winning them by a margin that gave her a net delegate victory that was smaller than what Obama was gaining from places like Idaho in the caucuses, because again, they sort of understood how the rules work in terms of apportioning delegates. And I think you're right about the Romney team. They understand that.
Yeah. One thing interesting also for Hillary Clinton is when Florida didn't count at all for the Democrats, Hillary Clinton was going to win Florida solid. I mean, it was her demographics here in the Democratic primary. And they couldn't even campaign and it wouldn't count whatsoever. So that she lost all that momentum. And then all these southern primaries where there's a large proportion of black Democrats voting made it easy for Obama. But at any rate, each cycle is different. It's going to be interesting how after this election, the Democrats are watching this closely because they're, whatever happens in 4 years, they've got to have a competitive primary nomination contest. And so we'll see what the Republicans do. Nobody wants to go through what the Republicans have gone through this year. This has been extremely divisive. It's hurt the Republican Party. It's hurt the Republican nominees. And so they got to figure out, how do we avoid this nastiness? It didn't happen when Obama and Clinton went after each other. They didn't get personal like this.
I think the potential, the nadir for, I think it's the House Republicans happened right around Christmas with that payroll tax debacle. I think there was a Rasmussen poll that I had referred to. I think it was in January when they were polling approval ratings. It actually got down to 5%. And so I don't think that worked out all that well. But in our last couple of minutes here, let me come back to, I think, one of the primary issues that resonate certainly with Republicans and conservatives, but I think across the board in the American electorate, and that has to do with just debt, budget deficits. I think you're probably familiar with over the summer when they were running into the debt ceiling, and we had that Bowles-Simpson plan there. I had the sense that the president might be able to sort of hold off some of the Democratic base and cut a deal for something that would look like 75% spending cuts, 25% revenue increases. Whether you get them from closing loopholes or raising rates remains to be seen. But that fell apart. And early on in the primary race, the field was asked, would you support 10% revenues through new taxes and 90% spending cuts? And they all said, no, we're not going to go there. Let's fast forward, because we're going to have to come back to this budget and debt issue regardless of who wins. What do you think the prospects of a grand bargain are, and what do you think it'll look like? What do you want it to look like if you don't,
Well, as I was saying, there's this massive fiscal cliff that hits December 31 with all these tax cuts expiring, which are painful for working people. Most of the Bush tax cuts are middle-class tax cuts, so it's not just rich people. And the payroll tax and this super committee failure and the debt ceiling. So all this is hitting during the lame duck session. And lame duck sessions, a mixed history. I think more likely it's going to be as whoever's president is going to postpone it to March. But the pressure is on. They've got to do something because they can't let all these tax cuts expire. So there's always this bounce that beginning of the first year after an election, and everybody wants to feel good. Right after Obama got elected, actually the approval of Congress went up because a lot of people were pride in the country that an African American get elected president, for example. So Republicans weren't charged up like they were after the 2010 wave election.
So you're hopeful, at least, that when we get into January, February of 2013, yes. that prospects for dealing with some of our major issues in the country.
Because there's a deadline, you've got to get it done.
That's right.
When they last summer, it was messy going through the debt ceiling increase, but there's a deadline, and you got. That's when Congress.
Deadline, sometimes you just punt it down the field a little bit, and the deadline keeps coming back. So. We've got to get it done, but I don't know if they can
It'd be
get
messy.
it for more than a couple of months. We're about to wrap up, so just any parting thoughts about just the primary, the election season, and what we've been talking about here today?
Well, it's a fascinating election season because we've had all these different leaders on the Republican side, and we're going to have this toss-up election, and Congress is up in the air, so it's going to be an exciting 8 months. So I look forward to following it closely.
Thanks. Dan Miller, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Really appreciate it. Let's hopefully talk to you again at some point.
Great. Thank you, Frank.